So this is a great chapter to come back to, and it opens up with us seeing Reggie finally dying. I wasn't like upset with him. I thought he was fine. I'm kind of just ready to move on to the next thing. But he's going over the logistics of their battle, and he says outsmarted by a modern day sorcerer. And it made me remember that, like, oh, that's right. Reggie kind of implied that he may have been a sorcerer from 1,000 years ago, because he like name dropped Kenjaku before, right? And maybe Tengen too. And that's just interesting because he has more of a like contemporary curse technique. But then again, I don't even really know how the curse techniques work. I mean, it hasn't ever really fully been explained yet how all this jujitsu and curse stuff works, but I'm sure it'll ultimately end with Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. But Megumi asks him, like, what's your relationship to Master Tengen? And Reggie's like, Tengen? Oh, right, that shut-in would still be alive. Meaning that, like, Tengen was always kind of, like, you know, doing his own thing. Which is understandable because he kind of has to. He's like the backbone of the jujitsu world. But then Megumi, like, cuts him off and he's like, okay, that's enough. It's like, why? This dude knows Tengen and was from 1,000 years ago. I would be asking him hundreds of questions. And then we get this subtle little implication here from Megumi that Tengen might be working with Kenjaku, and I guess that was always a possibility, but I really hope that that is not the case. I'm personally just not a fan of the overarching villain to have contrived everything and for him to be connected and have done everything that we see in the series. I mean, it's fine if he does a majority, which Kenjaku clearly has done, and it's going to be revealed that he's done even more. Like when we see Sumiki later on in this chapter, I'm pretty positive she is related to him in some way. I mean, if you go into Megumi's backstory with how he met Sumiki and how their whole family dynamic works, it makes total sense if that is because of Kenjaku. But Megumi's saying, like, Reggie's reaction to Tengen makes it seem unlikely that he's working with Kenjaku, and I hope that that's Gege right here saying that, like, guys, Tengen is like his own thing, he's not working with Kenjaku. I just hope that that's the case, because I would personally just be kind of disappointed if Tengen was working with him. It would just be too much at that point, you know? But then Reggie winds up giving Megumi his 41 points, and his reasoning is that he's just a spectator and that he's not really close with Kenjaku, which is obviously the truth here, but also we don't fully understand the backstory of the culling game yet. We don't know all of the deals that Kenjaku made with all of these people back 1,000 years ago. So I'm assuming not all of them were necessarily integral to the plan. Maybe there was just some that were like, hey, I'll join because, you know, why not? And I guess Reggie was one of them. But then right before he dies, he says, let fate toy with you before you die like a fool. And that's super interesting because I always kind of suspected that Megumi could die at the end. Gege said something, and I'm paraphrasing here, I don't remember where he said it, but he had already like known Megumi's full story, like since the beginning, as where that's not the case with all of the other characters. And I'm pretty sure I know one of Megumi's huge moments in the series that's going to happen like towards the end, but him dying was something that I wasn't entirely sure about, but this could be foreshadowing that possibly. Not saying it's guaranteed, and I certainly hope it's not. I love Megumi just like the rest of us, but just, you know, don't be too surprised if he winds up, you know. So then we're coming back to Takaba versus Hazanoki. Huge fan of Takaba, by the way, really liking this character. And we're seeing more of his curse technique, and apparently he's covering himself with ankake sauce. But Hazanoki says, like, with how many times I've bombed him, he should be dead 5 times over by now. And we see that he only has like a little bit of frizzy hair as a result of the damage. And he even regenerated somehow. But Hazanoki thinks that he didn't use reverse curse technique to do it. But then the Kogane appears and tells Hazanoki that Reggie had died, and then Hazanoki's like, alright, I don't want to play anymore. And Takaba, being the good guy that he is, just lets him go. But like, he asks him for his points, of course, which is smart. But Hazanoki refuses, and I talked about this in my spoilers video, but I'm pretty sure Hazanoki's gonna come back. He might even come back as like a baby face, which I'm on board with because he seems like a fine character who has potential to be very likable. And I guess it's also implied that he might be from 1,000 years ago as well, since he's so heavily tied to Reggie. Not really sure about that yet. Maybe he says it earlier. I don't really remember. Let me know in the comments. But then we're getting Takaba's curse technique reveal here, and apparently it's called comedian. When he comes up with something that he's certain will be funny, it becomes reality. It's a curse technique capable of opposing even Gojo. But when it comes to his own curse technique, he's utterly clueless. So at first you're like, oh my god, this is so broken, and it is. But on the other side, to balance this out, apparently Takaba's not even really aware of it. So that, like I said, kind of gives it this balance in a pretty cool way. Obviously, if this was in the hands of somebody more capable, they would be owning the culling game. But since it's in Takaba's hands, it makes it fair. Kind of like King from One Punch Man. He's pretty much God, but he doesn't know it. And I'm sure you've all been thinking of applications for this ability and how it could work, and so have I. But it ultimately comes down to the more nuanced rules of this technique, which I'm sure we're going to go into as the culling game furthers. But I'm really looking forward to seeing more of Takaba. He's one of the highlights of this arc for sure. Along with Higuruma, which clearly have this purposeful dichotomy going on. But we're coming back to Remy, and we're getting like a little bit of her backstory, which I don't really care about, to be honest. But it's just showing us, you know, why she is the way that she is, getting by on her looks. But in her internal monologue, she's using like wolf analogies, and then coincidentally, we see the divine dog come behind her, and he's about to, you know, which he rightfully should. But then we see like Sumiki appear in Megumi's mind telling him no. And like I said earlier, it's so likely that Sumiki is a product of Kenjaku in some way. I mean, he straight up made Yuji, so this isn't really that far-fetched. But then Megumi complies and he calls the dog off. Foolishly. And then, out of nowhere, Kurorushi shows up. The angel sorcerer who has the ability to remove curse techniques. The one that Tengen asked them all to single out because she is integral to the plan of opening the back door of the prison realm to release Gojo. But when we found out what her curse technique was, we knew that she was easily one of the most dangerous sorcerers, not only in the culling game, but just in the series in general. Now, Megumi getting knocked out here, I don't think she, took his curse technique because he would die, and I don't think he's dying yet. I mean, we're not at the end of the series, but I'm assuming she knocked him out because pretty sure Kenjaku is interested in Megumi as well, but not nearly as much as Sukuna, obviously. But Kurorushi is a pretty interesting character because we don't really know anything about her yet, so I'm really interested to see where her allegiance lies. I mean, we're just led to believe that pretty much everyone in the culling game is boys with Kenjaku to some extent, but I don't think it's that black and white. I mean, we just saw with Reggie that he was kind of just like an acquaintance of him or something. But then we're cutting away from that, and we're coming to a bunch of new sorcerers. This one guy, Dhruv Lakwala, however you say his name, it doesn't really matter what his backstory is because he's getting instantly killed at the end here. But the really interesting guy here is this rockabilly dude, the Ryu Ishigori. It says that he's a hotshot who boasts the highest cursed energy output of all of the players. So I guess this means all of the players in the culling game, not just in this colony, because I think Gege would have specified it if it was that. Meaning that he has a higher cursed energy, output than even Okkotsu, which makes this guy nigh unbeatable. Then we're coming to another crazy looking powerhouse boss type character with Takako Uro, but her curse technique allows her to control the sky. Yeah, it's getting really crazy now. And then we see Kuro Uroishi, a cockroach curse spirit from Kenjaku, freed from his curse spirit manipulation, which he obtained from Geto. Its rank is special grade, of course, and it's lying dormant until certain conditions disappear. Interesting. Not appear, but disappear. So keep that in mind. But they all aren't working together and they're not cohesive, so they're kind of at a standoff right now. But we're coming back to this Dhruv guy, and he's getting instantly taken out by our boy Okkotsu, who is finally back in the game. Really excited to see Okkotsu because he's awesome. And I was kind of just getting bored with the Demon Slayer approach that Gege has been doing with the last couple chapters, where we're just seeing this one singular fight draw on for a couple chapters. And I'm not saying that's always necessarily a bad thing, but we went from Yuji versus Higuruma, which was amazing, but then we went right into Megumi versus Reggie, and I kind of just wanted to see other things going on. And so it's nice to see Okkotsu show up here and just squashing this Dhruv guy who was kind of built up to be a the powerhouse. But the final narration here says 3 months after the night parade of 100 demons, Yuta came back to become a special great sorcerer, second only to Gojo in unusual abilities. Very unusual indeed, because it's still not fully explained why Rika is still cursing him. So this chapter starts off with us seeing the 2 new boss characters that I'm really interested in, Ryu and Takako, and I'll get into them of course, but they're both reacting to Drew's Shikigami disappearing after Okkotsu had slain him in the previous chapter. And when I saw this mole rat thing, whatever it is, it reminded me of the Shikigami that we saw in chapter 160 when Kenjaku was escorting Sasaki outside of the barrier, and we saw Ruve's giant mole rat Shikigami thing here, I guess seemingly fighting another person who has some kind of pterodactyl curse technique. I'm sure this is going to come back later on. Maybe we've already seen this. I don't know. Maybe one of you experts in the comments already know everything that's going on already. But we actually also see his other mole rat Shikigami in the background there, because that was explained in Drew's exposition. It said he has 2 types of independent Shikigami, and their orbiting trajectories constitute their own domain. And I guess it's later confirmed by Okkotsu in this chapter that he had used his domain, I guess, to lay claim to the stadium that he is protecting. But another thing about this big mole rat Shikigami going down, apparently that was the condition that needed to disappear so that Kurorushi, the cockroach curse spirit guy, would come out of laying dormant, because that's what it said in the previous chapter. And I thought that this was going to happen much later than just the follow-up chapter. I mean, it did say, instead of forming an alliance, these 4, as a result of their conflicting abilities and complex natures, found themselves in a standoff. And I guess it turns out that Drew, who is like oddly an important posthumous character, he would have been particularly a nasty opponent for Kurorushi, who appears to have some kind of cockroach curse technique. But anyway, Rockabilly Ryu here asks the Kogane to show the players who points have changed within the last minute in Sendai Colony. Very smart, of course. And with this information, he finds out that it was Okkotsu who had to have killed Drew. And another thing that was mentioned about Ryu in the previous chapter is that it claims, at least, that he has the highest cursed energy output of all of the players. And I don't remember what I said in the previous chapter, but I know I brought up Okkotsu because whenever you hear like cursed energy or cursed energy output, he comes into the discussion because he's always in that realm of things, right? Well, it turns out that Gege was also thinking that, because in the following chapter here, Ryu is specifically singling out Okkotsu because he's interested in him, and after he sees Okkotsu do a pretty impressive cursed energy slash, or whatever exactly he's doing here, I'm assuming he's just releasing cursed energy from the swipe of his sword, because that's kind of like the fundamentals that Gojo taught him. Ryu's not really impressed by that. He's like, his output isn't all that. What's surprising is his overall cursed energy. It's bottomless. And we've heard superlatives like that used all the time regarding Okkotsu's cursed energy. So while Ryu doesn't have bottomless cursed energy like Okkotsu does, because I'm not really sure if that's unique to him, but it's pretty much like his brand at this point. He still has a higher cursed energy output than Okkotsu. So meaning that what Okkotsu is doing in this chapter is obviously super impressive. Ryu is on another level than even that. Of course, we have no idea what this guy's curse technique is yet, but since he's being built up as one of like the 4 bosses of Sendai, I guess, I'm sure he is a beast. And since it said he has the highest output of all the players, it wasn't specifically said Sendai, I'm assuming he's got to be one of the strongest characters in the series at this point, especially since he's like kind of lukewarm on Okkotsu after witnessing what he's capable of. But anyway, we're coming back to Okkotsu and we see him like saving the people that were trapped in the stadium because of Drew, and I'm guessing this is like Gege's save the cat moment for Okkotsu. I don't know, maybe sometimes you really have to illustrate that, like, it's okay if a good guy kills people. Not everybody has to be like a Tanjiro or a Deku to be considered a good guy. But just as he's about to lead all of them out of this place, they have to go back in again because the cockroach curse spirit, and he quickly devours what appears to be one of my subscribers here. And this is pleasantly violent, I must say. I'm glad that we're getting some civilian casualties here. I mean, that's nothing new to Jujutsu Kaisen, but it's always nice that Gege kind of, reassures the audience that the stakes are not low. But going back to the whole cockroach control thing, Okkotsu says, are these cockroaches real? Each one has cursed energy and they're reinforced. A single one is no problem, but a swarm poses a serious threat, obviously. But what I think he's saying here is that these aren't like created by like his cursed energy or something. Like, it more so seems like these are like real cockroaches that exist in the world, and Kurorushi can just control them. Again, maybe I'm wrong, okay? But Rika comes back out, still not getting an explanation on what's going on with Rika exactly. It seems like Gege is really waiting to give us the reveal or the explanation on exactly what's going on with their new relationship. Also, I'm pretty sure this is going to ultimately lead to Okkotsu's downfall. That's another story for another time. But of course, Rika and Okkotsu, with a little group effort here, are able to take out the initial swarm of cockroaches, and we see that sequence with the cursed energy slash thing. And then we're getting some exposition on Kurorushi, and it says he has an endless appetite and eating stimulates parthenogenesis. So I know all of you experts out there already know what that is, but I'm just going to say this for like the 1% of you watching this that actually don't know what that is, because I didn't. But it's a spontaneous development of an embryo from an unfertilized egg cell. So I mean, I guess that's literally what's going to happen with this guy. He's going to, I don't know, give birth or something. I don't know if he needs to be fertilized, if you know what I mean. But I'm assuming Gege is going to skip that step, and I don't know, Okkotsu's boss fight here is going to lead to him thinking that he defeated him, and then I guess like a new, more powerful version like comes out of him or something. Or maybe it's like his offspring and it's like superior to him possibly. Or maybe that's Kenjaku's ultimate plan here with this guy, why he released him. Then we're coming to Okkotsu's internal monologue here, which is very pragmatic, and I appreciate it, where he's saying that there's probably more players like Kurorushi in the other colonies, which is probably true since Kenjaku had many cursed spirits in his control. And then he realizes that communication between the colonies is also necessary, and it is. And he's like, in addition to the 2 rules that Fujiwara proposed, we need a means of communication and a way to travel in and out of colonies. That's a total of at least 4 rules to get the situation under control. So those are the next 2 rules that we have to look forward to. I'm assuming at the end of Okkotsu's, first boss battle here, after he inevitably takes out Kurorushi, he will get 100 points somehow, and then he'll be able to make one of these rules, I'm guessing. I'm assuming he's going to do the communication one, since that's kind of more important at the moment rather than traveling in and out of the colonies. I'm thinking that that can just, wait till afterwards. But I'm really looking forward to them being able to communicate with each other. Although, it does raise the stakes with them not being able to. And he's even thinking about Gojo in this instance. He's like, Sensei, I won't let you kill your best friend a second time. I will kill Kenjaku, and by myself, I will obtain 400 points. But I think this is more so Gege trying to just establish that Okkotsu does have motivation like the other characters. He does want to take down Kenjaku, and he does want to help Gojo and everyone. He's just not as personally tied to all of that stuff as much as like Megumi and Yuji, So I think this was kind of put out there to just establish that like, hey, he wants to do this too, guys. But I just don't see him ultimately succeeding in that. I mean, I hope he does. Hey, it would be cool if he kills Kenjaku, but it just doesn't seem likely. Unless Yuji is the one that like fully defeats him, and then Okkotsu comes up and just takes his head off so that Yuji doesn't have to. But then the chapter ends with us seeing Kurorushi pull out like a cursed object called the Festering Life Sword, and we're getting some ambiguous exposition on it, an enchanted blade that mixes life and death. This chapter starts off with a strong opening from Okkotsu, who is just ostensibly dominating Kurorushi here, like lobbing off his cursed tool-wielding arm, giving him like a kung fu style backhand, and then capitalizing on top of that by just sending him into the river. And as Kurorushi is like regaining his ground using like his cockroach swarm, which like resembles a tornado, Okkotsu notices that he's being observed by 2 players, and as we the audience know, he has been observed for quite a while now. And it's the rockabilly looking guy Ryu and the partially transparent woman Takako. Ryu said to have the highest cursed energy output of all the players, and Takako said to be able to control the sky. We still don't have too much more input into these individuals, but they are pretty important because, like I said, they've been watching for a while and they've been set up as like the two big bads of, like, I guess Okkotsu's first wave of culling game bosses. But since Okkotsu is at a much higher level than Yuji and Megumi, therefore his opposition must be at a higher level than what they faced as well with Reggie and Higuruma. But then we get an inner monologue from Okkotsu explaining how he wants to take Kurorushi out. Since he's dealing with a cursed spirit, the path of least resistance would just be using positive cursed energy from reverse curse technique on him. And he likens this to how he dealt with Yuji before. This was like around the chapter 140-ish realm, because we were led to believe that he was like straight up executing Yuji because that was his perceived orders, but he was just fulfilling a binding vow to the higher ups and then immediately just use positive curse energy to heal Yuji from the wound. However, if he were to do this to, let's say, a cursed spirit like Kurorushi, he would be completely eviscerated by it. And we have seen this application of positive curse energy used before with Maharaga. Like his sword of extermination, the thing that he has like taped onto his arm, was said to be coated in positive cursed energy, which is one of the many reasons why he was such an incredible powerhouse, especially against curses. But since we have the two bosses spectating, Okkotsu, knowing that he's very likely going to have to face them after this, he doesn't want to show too many of his cards to them, such as being able to use reverse curse technique. But it's also revealed that he has Rika protecting the civilians inside of the stadium. They were originally trapped in there because of the first boss guy, Drew's whole Shikigami base of operations thing going on. But also on top of that, Kurorushi's cockroach swarm could just, devour them at any second. And I like this dynamic because, as we see, Okkotsu just by himself is dominating Kurorushi. So if he had Rika with him, then it would be no diff at all. So this is a great way of, upping the stakes. And then we get some brief dialogue between Okkotsu and Kurorushi where it's like, why are you interfering? Why are you killing me? And then Okkotsu's like, why are you killing people? Then Kurorushi, just like, a typical cursed spirit, doesn't really have a great explanation other than, I like the taste of iron. Then Kurorushi decides to use his blinding earthen insect trance, and we get what we get here. This is some like insect sack demons. This is like something straight out of South Park, I swear. And then Kurorushi sends like his cockroach swarm at Okkotsu, but he like nullifies them by, I guess, using like a big cursed energy blast, slamming it like into the river. Then the sack creatures go after him and it looks like Okkotsu is like slashing them by the sacks. Then after that, Kurorushi comes on the follow-up with his festering life sword, which was said to mix life and death. And I guess we're seeing some of the life aspect here, because as they're clashing, the eyeball looking things like shoot out of it onto Okkotsu's shoulder. And then they like emerge out of it, clearly doing some damage to him. But Okkotsu like easily beheads them, but while he's doing that, Kurorushi comes to the midsection with a slash and makes direct contact. And this was so devastating that like Ryu and Takako pretty much assumed that he's been defeated by this, and we see Kurorushi about to eat him because that's like his thing. He's constantly hungry because it stimulates parthenogenesis. But Okkotsu hits him with the reverse Uno card and instead puts his mouth on his and blows direct positive cursed energy into him. And like we established, it eviscerates cursed spirits and it like blows him in half. Then the Kogani appears and acknowledges that he had been defeated, and he gives Okkotsu 5 points. Now, as for the parthenogenesis stuff, it essentially means that he can like develop an offspring within him if fertilized. And also it was implied if he ate enough. Now I don't know if him eating that one civilian was enough or if he had some built up, although it did say that he was starving after he was released. And since we do see that part of his body is intact, I mean, I guess it's gonna like dissolve or disintegrate eventually. I mean, we don't see it on panel, but I'm just assuming that Gege just didn't have that whole parthenogenesis part of that as just like a throwaway exposition. Maybe it'll come back and play later, like once Okkotsu thinks everything's done, or maybe even during the Takako fight or the possible future Ryu fight, then he like appears maybe. I'm not saying it's guaranteed, but you know, it's just something to put in the back of your mind in case it happens. So after Kurorushi has been defeated, Takako immediately comes down and starts talking to Okkotsu in his ear, and it's like, seems like you can use reverse curse technique. Then the reality looks like it starts to warp, and I'm pretty sure this is Takako's curse technique, which was said that she can control the sky. That's all that we got on it so far. I'm sure we'll get a whole bunch of needlessly confusing exposition on it in the next 2 chapters maybe. This makes me wonder, like, is Okkotsu like gonna have to run the gauntlet here? I mean, so far he has. It was established that there was like the 4 bosses of Sendai, like the colony that he's in right now. It was like Druve, Kurorushi, Takako, and Ryu. Ryu clearly established as, you know, basically the strongest one here since he has the highest cursed energy output of all players. I don't know if it means everyone in the calling game or just in this colony, but it seems like he was established as like, you know, the biggest threat here, but they were all kind of at a standstill because of each other, and they didn't want to individually make their moves until one of them was taken out, and we actually see that happening. You know, Okkotsu took out Druve, then that led to Kurorushi releasing himself, then Okkotsu took out Kurorushi, now Takako's coming down, and I'm assuming that Okkotsu is going to take out Takako here, but since he is coming off of, you know, a mid-div battle against Kurorushi and is still suffering from these injuries, which I'm assuming he hasn't healed yet, unless he did. I mean, he can, you know, reverse curse technique, but he's going to have a much difficult battle here with Takako. And then if he does defeat her, then I guess that's when Ryu steps in and he's, you know, at death's door there. Or maybe that's when the parthenogenesis of Kurorushi comes into play. I also wonder if this is like a way that Gege is going to remove Okkotsu from helping Yuji and Megumi too much, like have him really beat down after these boss battles, almost to the point of, like I said, he's at death's door. Or possibly this is how he just nerfs Okkotsu because he's just way too powerful at this point. The stakes need to be raised even higher, I suppose, aside from just introducing characters who were just randomly as strong as Okkotsu this whole time, which is always a possibility with these sorcerers from 1,000 years ago. Not really sure. All right, so this starts off with us seeing Takako finally in action, and she's really not disappointing. And this is picking up from the end of the previous chapter where Okkotsu had blown positive cursed energy into the cursed spirit Kurorushi's mouth, making him explode. And once he was out of the picture, Takako came down and started talking to Okkotsu, saying like, oh, so you can use reverse curse technique, and that's leading us to where we are now, with her doing some kind of ambiguous attack to Okkotsu that leaves a crater in the ground, and he's even confused as to what's going on here because he's like, what caused that destruction? Then they go into an exchange of strikes, and we see more of Takako's curse technique where she's like pulling the space or almost reality around them, and it causes Okkotsu's arm to like distort. Then after striking him again, they go to their respective corners, and we see that Okkotsu's arm is fine because he's like, my arm is back to normal, it doesn't even hurt. And he says her curse technique probably controls space, but it actually can't crush her opponent. So maybe this kind of works the way that the Reality Stone worked in Infinity War, at least when Thanos was using it on the Collector's Planet. Like, he disassembled the Guardians, but then once he was gone, they were kind of like back to normal. So maybe her ability more so superficially affects things, but doesn't necessarily have a tangible effect on reality. But that leads back to the beginning of the chapter where she does seem to have some kind of tangible effect on reality with the initial attack that she gave to Okkotsu. But like I said, it confuses him, and it at least confuses me. I'm sure all of you in the comments already know everything that's going on. But going further, she says, my curse technique treats the sky as a surface. And Okkotsu's like, she's disclosing her curse technique. This is of course like one of the standard binding vows that we've seen since the beginning of the series. If you reveal to your opponent how your curse technique works, you get like a cursed energy boost. And this also goes back to the original explanation that we got for her curse technique, where the narration just said she can control the sky. But then going further, Okkotsu's like, sky, so space becomes a surface. Both her attacks blew past my guard and sent me flying. If that involves surfaces, there must be some trick. So this is probably like a more nuanced application of her ability. And like I said, maybe it inherently doesn't have a tangible effect on reality, but she can use it in a certain way that makes it so that it can affect reality, although it technically isn't. So then Okkotsu decides to move away from a physical battle and tries to go more so into a talk no jutsu type one, where he's basically saying, like, I can understand a weak person trying to do what you're doing, but you're strong. You could just get points from anyone. So Okkotsu kind of talked about this with Kurorushi, although it was more so just Kurorushi asking Okkotsu why he's killing them, being like him and the roaches. And Okkotsu was just like, well, why are you killing? But I'm sure he's doing this more so because Takako is like a human. We didn't see him have any kind of interaction with Druve, so maybe he did try to talk to him and that's what led to him taking him out. But Takako's saying, for us, we've come back from the underworld. The culling game is the first step to a second life. So this goes back to what I was talking about like many chapters ago, with this probably gives us more insight into what is going on with Sukuna. Like, I'm pretty sure this is why Sukuna did what he did and why Kenjaku made Yuji to become a vessel for him. Now, I don't know if Kenjaku did that for all of them, like he gave birth to all of the vessels for all of these 1,000-year-old sorcerers, because I guess we're under the assumption here that Takako, Ryu, and the others are kind of going through the same thing that Sukuna did. They made this deal with Kenjaku back in the day when possibly they knew that they were going to die or something like that, and Kenjaku was like, hey, I'll make you guys into cursed objects, and then in like 1,000 years or whatever, I'll have vessels ready for you. They'll consume your cursed object and then you'll become them, thus being resurrected, but you'll be a part of this culling game. I guess that was more incentive for them, because a common theme that these old sorcerers seem to have is that they're really interested in testing themselves and fighting strong opponents. But aside from that, it also goes into the underlying theme here of them having regrets, or else they wouldn't have accepted Kenjaku's invitation. And I'm pretty sure that falls into Sukuna, Reggie, and I guess Ryu possibly as well, and the rest that we're going to be introduced to. But anyway, Okkotsu's like, how can you be so desperate for your own sake? And then Takako says, are you one of the Fujiwara? What would one of your blood know about it? So we talked about this in the spoilers early in the week, and I was confused at least as to what was going on here, because I don't think we've ever had the Fujiwara name dropped in the series yet, or at least I'm not really aware of any characters who have that name. But an ancestor that we do know that is tied to Okkotsu is Michizane Sugiwara. Gojo says that he and Okkotsu have him as a common relative. So that made me, and I'm assuming many others, think that was she actually talking about Michizane Sugiwara, but apparently no, it's just this Fujiwara individual or just this Fujiwara family. And then we see like a panel of who I'm assuming is Fujiwara himself. Now this is for sure going to come back into play later on, and it's possible that maybe this individual or his clan or team or family, whatever, possibly led to the sorcerers competing in the culling game to be forced to take on Kenjaku's invitation. Because in Sukuna's like actual backstory, like the mythology that he is based off of, he was eventually defeated. So it's possible that maybe the Fujiwaras here are tied to that maybe. I don't know, I'm just taking guesses, but again, you guys already know the answer, so just look at the comments. But anyway, Ryu steps in and his curse technique is revealed, or at least kind of, and he shoots a granite blast out of his pomp. And I guess this goes back to the original exposition that we got on him, with he has the highest cursed energy output of all the players. But this guy is like a Vasto Lord from Bleach or something, because he has maybe the most impressive display of just raw cursed energy output that we've seen so far. But then after his initial attack, Okkotsu reminds us that Rika is protecting the people at the stadium. Talked about this many times, but this is just a way to raise the stakes for Okkotsu, because if he was able to just freely fight against them with the assistance of Rika, he would probably just dominate them, I guess. Because as we see, just him by himself is already extremely capable. I mean, he's been running the gauntlet so far, and he still seems to be the odds-on favorite to win, even if he is down against two opponents at once, which he's willingly taking on here. So then he just beelines towards Ryu, who fires these like homing cursed energy missile blast things at him. But Okkotsu wisely dips inside the hole that was made in the bridge, made from Rika destroying Kurorushi's cockroach swarm, and he uses that to close the distance with Ryu and winds up coming behind behind him. And this is smart, of course, because if Ryu was able to keep the distance that he was, he could just keep firing off his burst energy blasts, which seems to be like the main component of his game. So bringing it close quarters seemingly gives more advantage to Okkotsu, but it's probably not going to be that easy because Ryu is already able to block his initial attack. And that brings us to the end of the chapter where Okkotsu's like, let's bring this in close, and Ryu says, will that satisfy the hunger, Okkotsu? And I guess this is alluding more to the possible darkness that is within Okkotsu, which may be one of the reasons why Rika is even still a thing. So coming off of the previous chapter, we saw Okkotsu getting himself into like this three-way fight with Takako and Ryu, two of, I guess, the strongest sorcerers in this Sendai Colony. He fought Takako more so in the beginning of that chapter, but at the end we saw him like successfully evading Ryu's like initial cursed energy blast, which come from his hair, which I guess is like his curse technique. And he was able to close the distance by sneaking up behind him to get more into like a close quarters physical fight. And that brings us to the beginning of the chapter here, where Ryu is like, you want to get in close? And this is like the beginning of his like food analogies that he uses in this chapter. This like reminds me of Sukuna, especially like the way that he was talking in the Shibuya arc. And I don't necessarily know if Ryu is from Sukuna's time, because as I've been saying, he's like a rockabilly. So unless he decided to adopt that hairstyle like 1,000 years ago, meaning that he was like incredibly ahead of his time, it's possible that, I don't know, maybe he comes from like the 40s or the 50s or something. We don't really know the timeline of things with all of these people that Kenjaku has made deals with. The people that have been implied to be turned into like cursed objects and then eaten so that they can later be revived into this culling game. But speaking of that, he's giving us some more insight into his former life, where he says, I was a moderate eater. I fought worthy opponents and met a good woman, so I don't particularly have any regrets. But I can't stand this vague thirst, Okkotsu, and no one understands why I can't get no satisfaction. My life never had dessert. So I guess this just ultimately boils down to him needing like a worthy opponent. And this might mean that he didn't come from 1,000 years ago, because that was said to be like the golden age of Jujutsu, where there was like nothing but ultra powerhouses all around and whatnot. And when he was saying this, I was thinking like, okay, so I guess you never fought like a Sukuna type person. Clearly, because he would have lost to him if he did. I guess that's a large component of why he decided to join the culling game. Like I said, many of the other sorcerers here, especially from the past, kind of hunger for these fights. They're like Saiyans in a way. But then they have like this brief hand-to-hand exchange. Okkotsu saying like his output is high. He releases cursed energy with near instantaneous explosiveness. And I guess this goes back to the exposition that we got from him initially, where it said he has the highest cursed energy output of all of the players. And they go into like this traditional martial arts like shoulder clash thing, and this is pretty incredible. I'm not even sure if we've really seen this before, or at least I can't remember off the top of my head. Two extremely powerful sorcerers like this colliding and then having like electricity come off of them. This is like a Conqueror hockey clash from One Piece or something. And I guess stuff like this is going to be more prevalent as we go deeper into this arc, since this is like a funneling of all of the strongest characters in the series essentially. So we're going to see some crazy stuff on the power scale that we necessarily haven't seen before. But surprisingly, Okkotsu is the one that is getting like knocked away by this, and Ryu saying like, I'm unsatisfied because I ain't full, meaning like I guess he hasn't had like a truly worthy opponent yet, or somebody that has pushed him far enough to his liking. Then Ryu tries to capitalize on Okkotsu and like fires a granite blast at him, and Okkotsu like blocks it barehanded and then counters with like his own strike, sending Ryu like into the ground. And of course this gets the attention of Ryu, saying like, are you my dessert, Okkotsu? Meaning like, are you my worthy challenge that I'm finally going to get? And it seems like Okkotsu didn't necessarily beast through that blast as much as we probably initially thought, because we see in this panel here where Takako is coming up behind him, his hand was like nuked by that, like he's missing fingers and stuff. So I guess this was more so Okkotsu taking one to give one, because he knows that he can just use reverse curse technique to heal himself, so he can afford to have reckless defense like this. But as Takako is coming up behind him, she's giving us, I guess, the best explanation of her curse technique that we're gonna get maybe. She says, I don't hit the person, I hit the surface of the sky. and I break that surface like thin ice and my opponent with it. So I guess this is the secret of how she was able to make impacts in the previous chapter. Because if we go back to the previous chapter, we actually see her doing this, but we weren't really aware of it because we didn't have too much information on it yet. But in that chapter, when she does her follow-up attack on Okkotsu, we see her breaking the surface, and that like sends Okkotsu back. And that's where he realizes that his arm was back to normal after being warped, but he was still pushed back by her breaking the surface despite her not actually hitting him directly, which goes into his dialogue right after that sequence where he said her curse technique probably controls space, but maybe it can't actually crush her opponent. Because if she could, then she would just, I guess, be the strongest character in the series, right? She could just warp you and then break you into a million pieces, and then that's it. She sends Okkotsu into like a rooftop after that, and this angers Ryu because, you know, that was his dessert that he's going after, and they exchange some nice little insults, and Ryu fires a granite blast at her, but she uses her ability to warp the space around her and like twist the beam up and diverts it right back at him. And we read this in the spoilers, and I was really curious to see how he's going to be able to take this, and it appears that, yeah, he did take it on the chin. He can dish it out and take it as well. I guess not so surprisingly, he says, I've never been hit by my own technique before, which I guess goes back to how he's never had his dessert, which further goes into him never being tested enough or pushed far enough, which means it's very likely he never had a caliber of an opponent who would be able to redirect his attack back at him. Then Okkotsu gets back up, and they both kind of acknowledge that, hey, you know, he's pretty tough, as we kind of assumed he was. And Ryu gives us some more insight into reverse curse technique and the toll that it takes, because he says his reverse curse technique is a problem, which I talked about how he can just brute force block something like the granite blast, willingly damaging his limbs because he could just regenerate them. But it consumes a lot of cursed energy. He used it every time Kurorushi, Uro, and I used big moves, which is true because we saw Kurorushi really did a lot of damage to him in their brief fight. So before even coming into this triple threat match, he had already used reverse curse technique on like his torso and shoulder. Then going further, Ryu says, and I think you're finally bottoming out, Okkotsu. Bottoming out being used here is pretty interesting because Okkotsu's cursed energy was referred to as being bottomless. And I think this might give us more insight into what's going to happen at the end here. Then Ryu's like, I guess you ain't it. Meaning like, I guess you're not the one who's going to push me to where I want to be pushed. Then we get an inner monologue from Okkotsu basically saying that like Ryu doesn't target normal people, but he won't be mad if one of them die from like collateral damage. Meaning that he's not like the two other sorcerers that Okkotsu had to deal with. He's not going to go out of his way to like take out civilians and whatnot, but he won't hesitate like fighting around them, and if one of his blasts or whatever like kills them in the process, like it's whatever to him. And then he says, I wanted to put more distance between us and the people in the stadium, but that isn't going to happen. Again, these people that he was protecting in the stadium initially from Druve, and then after he took him out, then he had to defend them against Kurorushi's cockroach swarm. And that's also the reason why Rika wasn't involved in this fight in the first place, because she was protecting the people in the stadium in case they were to become collateral damage. Then Okkotsu just gets to the point of where it's like, well, I guess it can't be helped. And he holds up his hand showing like the Rika ring, and he says, come Rika, give me everything. And that's where the chapter ends. And this goes back to what I was talking about, him bottoming out, but also him having alleged bottomless cursed energy. Whatever kind of relationship he has with this new Rika, I think has to do with his cursed energy in general. It's possible that the ring maybe has some kind of binding vow to it or something, and Rika is like a composite of most of his cursed energy or something, and that's how he's able to contain it. Like he has this initial reserve in him as a whole that just makes him Okkotsu the powerhouse, but the rest of his cursed energy is just maybe too much for him to handle, so it's been converted into Rika, but also it's a part of the ring. Maybe the ring is working as a conduit or a vessel the way that Gojo wanted him to use the sword initially in Volume 0. Again, I'm just taking some guesses here. We don't really know too much about what's going on with him and the new Rika yet. Hopefully we'll get more insight into that into the next chapter. So in the previous chapter, we saw Okkotsu taking serious blows from Takako and Ryu, and this led to Okkotsu being like, all right, time to get serious. And he busts out the ring and he's like, come forth, Rika, give me everything. Because before this, we had only really seen her come out to help him against Kurorushi's cockroach swarm, and then she pretty much just protected the people in the stadium. But now it's like the gloves are off it's time to get serious, and that's where we're coming to the beginning of the chapter here, where we're seeing the fully revealed form of the new Rika. And it's been a long time coming because this whole new dynamic introduced like over a year ago. And as she's being introduced here, we're also finally getting an explanation on what Okkotsu's curse technique is, but just how this is all being explained is just very gege. That's all I can really say about this. But it says Rika is Okkotsu's curse technique and can store cursed energy for him. Rika remained with him after Rika Orimoto passed away, while connected to Rika through his ring, following as possible. Curse technique use. Rika's complete manifestation, cursed energy supply from Rika. He can maintain a sustained connection for 5 minutes. And like I said, while it's finally telling us what Okkotsu's dynamic with this Rika thing is, it's still kind of ambiguous, especially after what Takako says later on in this chapter and what Kenjaku said previously regarding Okkotsu. But that aside, this is easily one of the best, I'll say, dynamics in the series by far. And him having the 5-minute sustained connection is very necessary, because if he didn't have this, he would just be so unbelievably broken that there would never really be any stakes with this character, because we see just a glimpse of what he's capable of doing when he's fully unleashed against Takako. Like when I was first reading that, I was like, oh my god. But as for it saying curse technique use, I guess this is the copy aspect of Okkotsu's abilities, or as Kenjaku said, the ability to unconditionally copy curse techniques. And it's really weird how it works, because it's not like what we typically see with like the characters and, you know, stories that have the ability to copy things. Like usually they just like look at somebody or whatever their condition is and then they immediately have the ability. With Okkotsu, it's different. It kind of just subtly comes on and you never really know when or if he even copied an ability. And I think that's pretty cool, to be honest, but I assume that we're going to get more information on this as the story goes on. Also, as we go more into these Fujiwara individuals, or just Fujiwara, if he is actually related to Okkotsu or if it's just a misunderstanding from Takako. Regardless, we're going to get more information about them. And then of course we can't forget about Michizane Sugawara, who we know is confirmed, at least by Gojo, to be an ancestor of Okkotsu, who is also said to be one of the 3 big vengeful spirits, so he's implied to be in the same tier as Sukuna. He immediately goes for Takako, but then busts out cursed speech on her. We saw previously in Volume 0 that he manifested like this megaphone to be able to use it, but he doesn't need it anymore. He's come so far that he just straight up does it the same way that Inumaki does. And I like that Takako is recognizing immediately what's going on with it, so clearly she herself has come across a cursed speech user in the past. But he says don't move, and this like paralyzes her. And we're coming to the sequence I was talking about where I was like, oh my god. Like Okkotsu in the back, Rika in the front, just leveling her with strikes. Apparently this isn't even enough for Ryu, who's like, hey, you're way too soft, man, and fires off one of his hair seros at him. But Rika, just like Okkotsu, is able to swat this thing away barehanded. But this time Rika's hand was only like burned a little bit. We saw that it like blew off Okkotsu's fingers, and realizing that Ryu's like, that thing deflected it, it might be even tougher than Okkotsu. And then she just levels Ryu. But surprisingly, Ryu like immediately recovers himself and gives like a counter to Rika and sends her flying too. So yeah, I mean, we already knew this, but Ryu is like really, really powerful. And then this exchange, of course, intrigues him, because he's like, I still got an appetite that calls for an extra large helping. That's like the dynamic of his character. He's like a Saiyan or something. Then Okkotsu like pulls some of his hair out and makes these little Rika bat shikigamis. And it turns out that this is actually Drew's curse technique. Kako says the trajectories of the shikigami constitute the domain, and we knew that that was like the dynamic of Drew when he was introduced by having like those 2 big mole rat things. They constituted his domain. And this goes back to his copy ability. I guess it more so gives him the foundation to practically adapt an ability. But as Takako is fighting these she once again name drops the Fujiwara, saying like, you Fujiwara are always in my way. Are you that afraid of me becoming somebody? And then the narrator says the Sun, Moon, and Stars Squad is a group of assassins directly affiliated with the Toe. They pursue lives of selfless devotion and darkness, forsaken of the right to bear a name. So the Sun, Moon, and Stars Squad was the first bit of little info that we got on Takako when she was first introduced. But going further, it says, yet that person gave me a name to execute me as a proxy for that person's crime of killing a member of the same clan. So more ambiguous dialogue here. Obviously this relates to like the Fujiwara stuff, and considering that this keeps coming up and we keep getting little bits of info into Takako rather than Ryu, I'm assuming that Takako is probably going to survive this fight and maybe go on to stick around or something like that. I don't know if she's gonna have a full-blown face turn, but as we've seen so far with the other individuals like Megumi and Yuji, one of the people that they meet in their stretch of chapters sticks around afterwards. So Takako could be that person for Okkotsu. And then we get this little exchange between Okkotsu and Takako where he's like, I don't know what my ancestors did to you, but living only for yourself will only get you so far. So I don't know if this is Okkotsu like directly realizing that he is related to Fujiwara, or if he's just kind of saying this to just appease Takako, or he's just giving her the benefit of the doubt, like assuming that she probably knows more than him because she comes from the past. And then she says, live for others, you don't need to be anybody special. The only ones who can say that are people who have already achieved something. And this, I guess, goes back to the regrets that she may or may not have had, which is another element of her possibly coming into the culling game, and which I think is another reason why she's probably going to make it out of this. Or if she does wind up kicking the bucket, she's going to drop some super useful exposition before she does. That brings us to the end of the chapter where Ryu is like, oh, shut up at this point, words are pointless. And then all three of them activate their domain expansion. So this is incredible because I'm pretty sure this is the first time we're ever seeing something like this. I mean, we didn't even really get to see 2 domain expansions going at it that much, let alone 3. But not only that, this is like the debut of Okkotsu's domain expansion, and I have no idea what it could be. I assume it has something to do with copy, right, since that's like his innate ability. But what's going to happen at this point? Well, from what we've seen, the stronger domain will usually overpower the weaker one. So in theory, Okkotsu should just be able to expand over the both of them. Unless they're closer in power than we think, then maybe they all kind of butt heads with each other and they're all kind of simultaneously existing. I mean, we're at least going to get to see a glimpse of what Takako and Ryu can do, right? Because it would be a little anticlimactic and weird if they're just completely blown away before us seeing anything about them. Or they could always just manifest their domain enough to break out of Okkotsu's domain expansion if he does wind up overpowering them. So many intriguing variables going into this, and this is just new territory for the story and the readers. And I'm just super curious to see where this is headed. So coming off of the end of the previous chapter with us following this grand triple threat match between Okkotsu, Uro, and Ryu, it led to all three of them simultaneously activating their domain expansions, which was going to be the first time that we were going to see something like this happen in the series. And that brings us to the beginning of the chapter where seemingly it's happening, and the narration says, in overlapping domains, the can't miss attacks cancel each other out. In order to avoid giving Okkotsu the initiative, Ishigori and Uro needed to keep Rika out of the barrier. And going further, it says Ishigori had just knocked Rika over 20 meters away, so they didn't need to do anything special. Rika would never reach the barrier before construction. So yes, this did happen in the previous chapter while they were all having their fight. Ryu got punched by Rika and got leveled, of course, but then he regained his composure and leveled Rika back in a pretty impressive display of power and sent her flying. And as it says, 20 meters away. So essentially, there was no way that she was going to interfere with this happening. And the narration is further letting us know that the last remnants of Rika Orimoto's will inside of the new Rika could not accept that. And her Cyclops eye opened the same way that Rika's did at the end of Volume 0. But at the same time, none other than Kurorushi returns. And on its way back to battle, it sent a swarm of cockroaches at Rika to keep her distracted. But the narration says, before going dormant, Kurorushi had reproduced by parthenogenesis. After the parents' exorcism, the cursed energy of fear throughout Japan once more power poured into the child. Even if Kurorushi the player died, Kurorushi the cursed spirit would still go strong. So it actually happened, and we talked about this a couple of chapters back when the parthenogenesis aspect was introduced with Kurorushi. Parthenogenesis in a nutshell is essentially the ability to reproduce without having to be fertilized. And we thought, you know, this is probably going to happen because Gege mentioned it in like Kurorushi's initial exposition. And we thought, you know, I guess this kind of has to come into play. Or else it would just kind of be odd of Gege to tell us that and then nothing comes of it. But the new Kurorushi is not only a nice little twist here, but he's also a foil for our characters here, but also the audience. Because going further, it says the clash of 3 domains is more complex than for 2. As they erected their barriers, the internal and external conditions differed, and there was an unexpected intruder causing the barriers to break. So yeah, unfortunately, we're not actually getting to see the first triple domain expansion. And the way that it's worded here makes me think that maybe it was bound to collapse, since it was kind of on shaky ground anyway, with it saying as they erected their barriers, the internal and external conditions differed. So while we're not getting the awesomeness of a triple domain expansion right now, I assume that this is probably going to come back later on at some point, because Gege wouldn't be this mean to his audience. Like, I think this is more so just letting us know what's to come, possibly. I mean, it's even possible that we'll see like a 4-way domain expansion in the future, like who knows. But I do think we will get to see like the complexities of something like this fully fleshed out. But on top of this, we're also still not getting to see what Okkotsu's domain expansion is, you know, let alone Uro or Ryu's. And this is also something I expect us to see later on, you know, Okkotsu's domain expansion. Pretty sure Gege won't leave us hanging with that either, because after all, we're only still kind of in the first quarter maybe of this arc, so there's still a lot more developments in the battles and the characters and the power scale to come. But Kurorushi like goes after Takako, and this could be because she was already cut up from Okkotsu using his like Shikigami bat things, and Drew's ability with his Shikigami designating his domain, like cutting her up in the previous chapter. And Kurorushi's whole thing is that he loves the taste of iron, you know, blood. But also it goes into Kurorushi being a bad matchup for Uro because it says whom she considered a particularly nasty opponent, and this goes back to the original dynamic of Sendai Colony. Like the 4 big powerhouses all kind of staying in their own corners because they all deemed each other problematic and bad matchup. So they were waiting for like each other to be taken down. And that's when Okkotsu came into play and he took down Drew, then he took down Kurorushi, and that's when we saw Uro come into play, and then Ryu shortly after. But while Uro is being distracted by Kurorushi, Okkotsu comes up behind her and just kicks her. And she tries to activate her curse technique, but because she had just activated her domain expansion, the curse technique burns away, making it difficult to use. So she's basically a sitting duck here, and Kurorushi uses his curse tool and sends those little parasite things into her arm, and it like bites her arm off. But not only that, because while her arm is off, like Rika comes up and like eats it. And this is smart, of course, because in theory she would just immediately use reverse curse technique and like connect her arm. And that leads us to what Ryu says when he's like, Okkotsu's thorough. Even if Uro uses a reverse curse technique, regenerating a missing arm would be a hell of a feat. And then immediately after this, Ryu fires like a granite blast right at her and puts her down for the count. She's not like killed or anything because it hasn't been noted that she was. I think she's just, you know, KO'd or whatever at this point. But this further makes me think that she's probably gonna survive this arc and then maybe be an ally to Okkotsu, because I've been saying, like, you know, our protagonists before this came out of their own little stretch of chapters with a new ally, and the way that Uro and Okkotsu's dynamic has been is kind of making me think that that's the case here. And also we know that Okkotsu is like super adept at reverse curse technique, and I have no doubt that he could use it to just straight up regrow her arm, you know, Sukuna style. So it's possible that he winds up doing that, and then she's like, oh, I guess you're not such a bad guy after all. All right, I'll be your friend. Especially since there's like so much more backstory that needs to be fleshed out with her, namely the Fujiwara stuff and why she thinks Okkotsu is a Fujiwara. But anyway, the blast that Ryu shot at Uro also hits Kurorushi, and we get some more exposition saying that Ryu is the only sorcerer capable of releasing the same amount of power regardless if he's activated his curse technique. technique. So I guess this is clearing up why he's able to do this stuff despite activating his domain expansion, because as we saw, Uro just really couldn't utilize her curse technique, because we also find out in this chapter that Ryu's curse technique is cursed energy discharge, which is like such an unbelievable ability to have in Jujutsu Kaisen. But he's just so powerful that it doesn't even matter if he's using his curse technique. He can still release the same amount of power just by using, standard Jujutsu. But anyway, after this, Okkotsu like starts walking up on Ryu, and it looks like he's just one-shotting Kurorushi with, I'm assuming, positive cursed energy, the way that he took out the original Kurorushi, but with a kiss previously. And we come to the end of the chapter where they're both like squaring off with each other, looking like they're about to do like their final moves. Ryu says, "Welcome to my table, Okkotsu," and then we see like panels of desserts, which is referencing that this is like Ryu's ultimate goal here, because it was implied that he was never pushed as much as he wanted to be, like during his heyday as a sorcerer. Like he always had meals and dinner or whatever, but he never had his dessert. So now him having this grand final battle with Okkotsu and Rika is finally him getting it. And we see him charging up like a granite blast in his hair, and Okkotsu goes into like his same stance that he did at the end of volume 0 in the last moments of his fight against Geto. But the narration says Okkotsu's curse technique still hasn't replenished. So this is pretty interesting. If he's unable to create like a similar cursed energy blast like he did against Geto, or if he's unable to just copy the granite blast or whatever, then he might be in trouble here. But then again, Okkotsu's power set is so ambiguous and nuanced here that his curse technique might not even really be a factor here. Like I said, going into this being like misleading dialogue, possibly like making the reader think that he's in trouble, but he actually wasn't the whole time, or he is in trouble, but man, it seemingly has to be the end of the fight in the next chapter, right? Coming off at the end of the previous chapter, Ryu had defeated Uro and Okkotsu had defeated Kurorushi, so it came down to the two of them, in their final face-off, very reminiscent to how Okkotsu was facing off with Geto at the end of volume 0. And that brings us to the opening exposition of this chapter, where it says, Yuta can only release a directed high output blast of cursed energy while Rika is completely manifested, even at full power. However, it is slightly weaker than Ishigori's blast, so he needed to rapidly build up cursed energy and fire before his opponent reached maximum power. So that makes sense, and I guess it goes back to the original exposition that we got on Ryu, when it said that he had the highest cursed energy output of all the players. Again, I don't know if that just meant Sendai Colony, or if it just meant the entire Culling game, but considering that it's been confirmed multiple times that he surpasses Okkotsu in this field, I guess Ryu really does have the highest output of all of the players. But going further, it says that was his intention, like quickly firing off a blast before Ryu can go to maximum power, taking away Ryu's advantage. But the intense look in Ishigori's eyes expressed over 400 years of hunger and thirst. So that's super interesting for multiple reasons. So first of all, this is kind of like showing that Okkotsu is appeasing Ryu here when he really shouldn't, but he's feeling, empathy for him, because this is like his purpose in life, I suppose. Like I said many times, he's kind of like a Saiyan, where he's hungering to be tested to his full limits, wanting his dessert, which he's never had. And since Ryu isn't like a full-blown unredeemable villain, he's kind of like a tweener at this point. Okkotsu, being the nice guy that he is, kind of like, okay, I'll appease you, I'll give you your dessert, but just this once. Now another thing is the 400 years of hunger and thirst. I don't know if this was revealed earlier, maybe I missed it, but I think this is the first time we're getting insight into how old Ryu is. Now I initially suspected that he was like from the 40s or 50s or something, because of his rockabilly aesthetic and his comfortability with cigarettes and how he visualizes, contemporary desserts and things like that. But I guess this means that he's from over 400 years ago. And 400 years ago is also mentioned by Kashimo, one of the other big players in the Culling game, who we're probably going to see in action in the next Colony stretch of chapters. I'll talk about that at the end of the video. But if Kashimo and Ryu come from the same era, why didn't they fight each other? Why didn't Kashimo give Ryu his dessert? But Kashimo also asks, like, where's Sukuna? And since we know that Sukuna comes from the Golden Age, like, over 1,000 years ago or whatever, maybe that was the incentive that Kenjaku gave to Kashimo to join the Culling games. Like, hey, if you join this game, you'll be teleported to the future, and Sukuna will be there, and you'll get to fight him. But anyway, they're cursed energy blasts converge, and this excites Ryu, and he's like, here's an idea, let's go again. And Okkotsu has Rika fire her own individual blast, but at the same time Okkotsu like leaps at him to attack him while he's being distracted, like deflecting the blast. And Ryu realizes this, and it says, in addition to domain expansion and this meal with me, I don't think you can replenish very fast. This is in reference to the previous 2 chapters where Ryu, Uro, and Okkotsu all simultaneously activated their domain expansions, which of course is super draining on your cursed energy and also hinders your cursed technique ability, you know, for some time afterwards. And at the end of the previous chapter, it told us that like Okkotsu's cursed technique hadn't replenished yet. And we were kind of speculating like, oh, does that mean that Okkotsu's not really going to be able to measure a substantial counterattack here because of that? Or is this kind of just a red herring and he's actually going to replenish it within moments after this? And yeah, it turns out that that's the case. It was kind of a red herring just to put the reader on edge, kind of raise the stakes a little bit, because it says Yuta's curse technique had already replenished. And as Ryu like fires off a granite blast point blank at him, Okkotsu warps space and deflects the beam into the air. And when I first read this, I got hyped, and I'm sure you did too. And then Ryu's like, was that Uro's curse technique? I didn't think he was a mere curse speech user. I thought that big thing had a curse technique of its own, but I was wrong. Okkotsu's curse technique is copy, but there must be a major condition for it. So when did he satisfy it? When I wasn't looking? Surely it isn't conditionless. And this is kind of what has been going through my, and I'm sure everyone else's mind regarding Okkotsu's curse technique. Or at least his ability to copy others, because we've never seen him fulfill a condition or anything. It's always been ambiguous. And then Ryu says back then, and he remembers Rika eating Uro's arm. So I guess that's it. So either Rika consuming the body part of a sorcerer or their blood is the condition for Okkotsu to receive their curse technique. So maybe it's not consuming the flesh, but more so the blood of a sorcerer. Because we know that he copied Drew's curse technique, and as far as we saw, he didn't like lop off any of his body parts or anything, but he did draw blood from him. Now, as for him getting cursed speech from Inumaki, that's a little more subtle, but in volume 0, after Geto like whoops him up, he is bleeding from the mouth, and Rika does grab him and the others in her like jujutsu bag or whatever, and then dumps him off so that Okkotsu can reverse curse technique them. So maybe it was at that moment that Rika absorbed Inumaki's blood, or maybe Okkotsu did, and that's how he was able to use curse speech. Also, I don't know what the hive mind's opinion on this is and what they've all universally accepted as the correct opinion. So maybe everyone has already figured out what the right answer is. I just don't know. I'm just taking some guesses here. But it seems like it's blood consumption possibly, which is similar to what Toga does in My Hero. And interestingly enough, this is like the popular theory on what Sukuna's inherent curse technique could actually be. That like he eats other sorcerers or something and gains their curse techniques. Now obviously not confirmed yet. We hardly really know anything about Sukuna. And I don't know if this means that there's a connection between the Michizanis and Sukuna and Okkotsu, but Uro seems surprised that Okkotsu's ability was copy. And considering that she was the one who accused him of being a Michizani, wouldn't she already know that their curse technique was copy if it is something that Okkotsu would inherit from them? But anyway, Okkotsu does Uro's thin icebreaker to Ryu, and then immediately just hammers him on the head with Rika. But Ryu, being the beast that he is, immediately comes back and just levels her again. And it says that a single blow was too much for Rika, even when completely manifested, would cause her to reach her limits. For some reason, I really like that Ryu is just a super powerhouse. But then they go more into hand-to-hand combat, and Ryu is like finally satisfied. He's like, this is my dessert. Then Okkotsu like hunches down and grabs Ryu by his jacket, almost like he's gonna do like a judo move or something. And he's like, we're done. And the granite blast that he deflected earlier using Uro's curse technique comes down and lands right on Ryu. And he's seemingly finished by this, and he says, thank you. My stomach's now full. And we see like the dessert plates are empty now. And that's the end of the chapter. So I'm assuming that this is like it. And the way that Ryu looks here is making me think that he's going to give his points to Okkotsu. So I think that Ryu had like 77 points and Okkotsu has like 40 or something like that. So he'll be able to make one rule change if this does happen. And a couple chapters back, he said that there was like 2 rules that needed to be made first and foremost. One was like the ability to move between barriers, and the other was for like a means of communication. And I wonder which one Okkotsu's going to make. So I assume maybe the movement between barriers, but also means of communication would be very useful as well. But if this is the end of the Sendai Colony portion here, I'm guessing we're going to come to the second Tokyo barrier with Hikari and Panda, because Hikari pretty much said that he's going after Kashimo because he's perceived to be like the biggest threat or the strongest. And he also said that Panda should go find Angel, but obviously we saw a couple chapters back that Angel had found Megumi. So I'm guessing we're just going to come to Hikari, maybe taking on Kashimo next. So in the previous chapter, we saw Okkotsu and Ryu coming to the conclusion of their battle. This was after Ryu had defeated Uro and Okkotsu had defeated Kurorushi. It eventually came down to Okkotsu deflecting Ryu's blast and having it fall on him, which ostensibly defeated him, but also made Ryu satisfied, where he said, "My stomach's now full," meaning like he finally had his dessert, which is like, I guess, his ultimate goal in life and the implied reason why he joined the calling game in the first place. And that brings us to the beginning of this chapter, where we see like a flashback of Okkotsu talking to Uro, and she says, "You're reaching your limit. I've seen it. What surpasses the horizons of sorcerers, cursed spirits, and strong fighters is overwhelming aggression that disregards all else, like a calamity." And as she's saying this, we see Sukuna from the Heian era, from like 1,000 years ago or whatever. And this is fascinating, of course, because one of the most intriguing aspects of this series is Sukuna, especially in his prime when he was an vengeful cursed spirit. And surprisingly, he's, I guess, a human right here, right? Because that's what's said about him in his backstory. He was originally a human. Even though he looks like a straight up curse here, we still don't have much insight into why he has this appearance. Like, why does he have 4 eyes? Why is the right side of his face all cursey like that? Why does he have 4 arms? The last time we got a really good look at Sukuna's true form was like on a cover page. Forget the exact chapter, I'm sorry. But this is by far the best look that we've got at him so far. It's also heavily implied that he's on the next level of jujitsu, like stuff that hasn't even really been explored currently in the series, because I guess this knowledge was more so common to like the top of the power scale back in the Heian era, especially because when he was going against Jogo and he busted out his fire curse technique or whatever that is, he said, "Oh right, you wouldn't know about this." And I guess that had more than one meaning, because also the audience, wouldn't know about what he was doing. The other interesting thing here is him appearing as Uro is saying this. So I guess this means that she's thinking of Sukuna when she says this, right? Which I guess also confirms that she does in fact come from the Heian era, possibly. Which, we speculated about before. So this could also mean that Uro maybe was Sukuna's lover, or one of Sukuna's lovers, because going further into the chapter, we come to Okkotsu talking to Ryu, and Ryu says, "You're too soft, Okkotsu, and I ain't praising you." Then Okkotsu's like, "Uro said the same thing. There's no benefit to sparing an opponent's life." And then Ryu's like, "She was still alive? My blasts must have been weaker after domain expansion." Going back to what happened 2 chapters ago, he hit her with a granite blast, but we didn't see the game master come and say that she was like defeated or anything, and then he got some points, so we pretty much knew that she was still alive. Then going further, it says she kept bringing up something. Was it a lover's quarrel? Then Okkotsu says something like it. So this is the second time that the lover subject has been brought up with Uro. Back in chapter 176, when Okkotsu was like initially talking to her, she said, "For us, we've come back from the underworld. Someone who completed her first life without regret wouldn't accept Kenjaku's invitation. The culling game is the first step to a second life." And then Okkotsu said, "Don't you have a lover or friends?" And she got annoyed by this, of course, and it eventually led to her saying, "Are you one of the Fujiwara?" Which we still don't really have any insight into. But that, along with what's being said in this chapter, with Sukuna showing up and seemingly her thinking about him, or Okkotsu reminding her of him, maybe that is the case. Maybe her and Sukuna had something going on. And her bringing up the Fujiwara, especially in like a vindictive context, maybe the Fujiwaras or Fujiwara himself was the one who wound up defeating Sukuna, or wound up making it so that he had to make the deal with Kenjaku. Because in the original lore of Sukuna, like the mythology that this character is based on, he is eventually defeated by someone. But anyway, going further, Okkotsu eventually asks Ryu to give him his points, and he does. And it's also revealed that Uro gave him her points as well. And along with the points that he got from killing Druve and Kurorushi, Okkotsu now has 200 points. In chapter 174, he mentions that, at least 2 rules need to be proposed anyway, so I guess he's just gonna take care of it himself. And this makes sense considering the gauntlet that he had to go through. I mean, he had to pretty much solo Sendai Colony. But Okkotsu said, in addition to the 2 rules that Fujiwara proposed, we need a means of communication and a way to travel in and out of Colony. So I'm guessing that's the 2 rules that he's going to make. Considering that he didn't make them in this chapter, I guess as we go through the Hikari fight, maybe it'll get revealed then, or maybe it'll get revealed after Hikari defeats this mangaka guy, which we'll get into. But getting those 2 rules out of the way is pretty big because the main cast hasn't really communicated with each other in quite a while, and traveling in and out of colonies is huge. This way they can finally all group up again and then really start wrecking house and really start getting things done in the culling game.